Commander Zeftar had witnessed the fall of 3 galactic empires, survived the void wars that consumed entire star systems, and commanded fleets that turned asteroid fields into graveyards. His chitinous exoskeleton bore scars from plasma burns, phase weaponry, and quantum blades. In his 4 centuries of military service, he had seen every conceivable form of warfare, every possible strategy, every type of warrior the galaxy could produce. Or so he thought, until the day a single human sergeant, armed with nothing but primitive kinetic weapons and an attitude that defied every military doctrine Zeftar had ever studied, walked into his command center and casually asked, "So, Commander, ready to see how Earth's rejects fight a real war?" What happened next would force the galaxy's most decorated veteran to question everything he knew about combat, courage, and what it truly means to be a warrior. Because humans, as it turned out, didn't just fight wars, they redefined them entirely. Commander Zeftar's mandibles clicked in what his species considered deep contemplation as he stood before the massive holographic display in the war room of the Galactic Defense Coalition's primary command vessel, the Eternal Vigilance. The display showed a 3-dimensional representation of the Kepler 442 system, where red dots indicated the positions of the invading Vrakti swarm. Each red dot represented a bioship the size of a city, filled with warrior drones bred for one purpose: consumption of all organic life. The Vrakti had already devoured 17 systems in their latest surge across the galaxy's rim. Worlds that had stood for millennia were now nothing but barren rocks, stripped of every molecule of carbon-based matter. The Coalition's finest military minds had thrown everything they had at the swarm: antimatter torpedoes, quantum disruptors, even experimental temporal weapons. Nothing had worked. The Vrakti adapted, evolved, and continued their relentless advance. Zeftar's 4 eyes tracked the movement patterns of the enemy fleet, his tactical computer running probability calculations that all returned the same grim result: defeat. His species, the Kythera, were renowned throughout the galaxy for their strategic brilliance. Their crystalline minds could process thousands of variables simultaneously, making them natural generals and admirers. Zeftar himself had commanded Coalition forces in 47 major conflicts, including the legendary Siege of Proxima, where he'd held off an entire hegemony battle fleet with nothing but mining ships and sheer tactical genius. But this was different. The Vrakti didn't follow conventional military doctrine. They were a force of nature, as unstoppable as entropy itself. His tactical computers couldn't find patterns in chaos, couldn't predict the behavior of creatures that operated on instinct rather than strategy. The door to the war room hissed open, and General Mordun strode in, his massive Garathi frame filling the doorway. The bear-like alien's fur was streaked with gray, evidence of the stress they'd all been under since the Vrakti offensive began. Behind him walked a figure that made Zeftar's antennae twitch with confusion. It was a human. Zeftar had heard of humans, of course. The newest species to achieve interstellar travel, barely 3 centuries since their first crude fusion engines had carried them beyond their home system. They were considered something of a curiosity among the older races, aggressive, unpredictable, and possessed of an almost pathological inability to accept defeat. Most Coalition members viewed them as useful for menial labor and perhaps some light infantry work, but hardly the equals of species that had been waging interstellar war for millennia. This particular human was unremarkable by most standards. Average height for his species, with brown hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything in return. His uniform bore the insignia of a sergeant, a rank so low that Zeftar had to search his memory banks to recall its exact position in the human military hierarchy. What truly baffled the Kythera commander was why General Mordun had brought this creature to a strategic planning session that would determine the fate of entire worlds. "Commander Zeftar," Mordun said, his voice carrying the weight of barely contained desperation, "I'd like you to meet Sergeant Jake Harrison of the Terran Marine Corps. He's here as part of the Coalition's new cooperative initiative. The human stepped forward and extended his hand, a primitive greeting gesture that Zeftar had read about but never experienced. After a moment's hesitation, the Kithara commander extended one of his articulated limbs to briefly touch the human's palm. "Pleasure to meet you, Commander," Harrison said, his voice carrying an easy confidence that seemed at odds with his lowly rank. "Hell of a tactical situation you've got here. Mind if I take a look?" Before Zeftar could object, the human had moved to the holographic display and was studying the Vrakti fleet positions with an intensity that surprised the Kithara. Harrison's eyes tracked the movement patterns, his brow furrowed in concentration. After several minutes of silence, he let out a low whistle. "Yep, you're screwed," Harrison said matter-of-factly. "Conventional tactics aren't going to work against these things. They're not really thinking in a way you or I would understand it. More like angry locusts with starships." Zeftar's mandibles clicked in irritation. "Sergeant, I have analyzed every possible strategic approach to this conflict. The Vrakti possess overwhelming numerical superiority, adaptive defensive capabilities, and regenerative biotechnology that renders most of our weapons ineffective. Your assessment adds nothing to our understanding." Harrison turned to face him, and for a moment, Zeftar saw something in the human's eyes that gave him pause. It wasn't fear or desperation like he'd been seeing in the eyes of coalition officers for weeks. It was something else entirely, a kind of predatory calculation that seemed completely at odds with everything he'd been told about human nature. "You're right about all of that," Harrison said. "But you're thinking about this like a civilized war between civilized species. The Vrakti aren't civilized, and sometimes when you're fighting monsters, you need to think like a monster yourself." General Mordun shifted uncomfortably. "Sergeant Harrison's species has a unique perspective on warfare. Their military history is extensive." "Extensive?" Harrison laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both amused and slightly unsettling. "General, that's like calling the ocean damp. Humans have been perfecting the art of killing each other since before we discovered fire. We fought wars with sticks and stones, wars with chemical weapons, wars where we cracked atoms and turned entire cities into glass. We fought wars in trenches filled with poison gas, wars in jungles where you couldn't see your enemy until his knife was between your ribs, and wars where boys who'd never been away from home got dropped into hell and somehow found ways to keep fighting when any sane creature would have given up." Zeftar processed this information, cross-referencing it with what little data the Coalition had on human military history. The numbers were staggering. In just their recorded history, humans had participated in over 14,000 named conflicts, with casualty rates that would have driven most species to extinction. Yet somehow, they not only survived, but thrived, eventually reaching the stars. "Your species' apparent aptitude for self-destruction is well documented," Zeftar said carefully. "However, I fail to see how this relates to our current strategic dilemma." Harrison grinned, and Zeftar found the expression oddly predatory. "See, that's where you're wrong, Commander. We're not good at destroying ourselves. We're good at destroying everything. It just took us a while to find targets that weren't us." The human turned back to the holographic display, his fingers dancing over the control interface with surprising familiarity. The display zoomed in on the central Vrakti formation, revealing the massive bioship that served as the swarm's primary coordination node. "You've been trying to fight these things ship to ship, fleet to fleet," Harrison continued. "Classic strategic thinking. Match your strengths against their weaknesses, avoid their strengths, force them to fight on your terms. Problem is, they don't have weaknesses in the conventional sense, and you can't really force them to do anything because they're essentially a biological weapon system rather than a military force." Zeftar's tactical computer began running new calculations based on the human's words. The results were interesting. Harrison was correct that conventional fleet engagement had proven ineffective, but what alternative did they have? "What would you suggest?" Mordun asked, his voice carefully neutral. Harrison's grin widened. "Well, General, that depends. How attached are you to fighting fair? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Zeftar felt his certainty beginning to waver. In all his centuries of military service, he'd operated under the assumption that warfare, even at its most brutal, followed certain universal principles. There were rules, conventions, standards of conduct that separated civilized species from mere beasts. The idea of deliberately abandoning those principles was almost unthinkable. And yet, as he looked at the holographic display showing the inexorable advance of the Vracti swarm, Zeftar found himself genuinely curious about what this strange, violent species might have learned during their long history of what humans apparently called total war. "Explain," he said simply. Harrison nodded and began manipulating the display, highlighting various points throughout the Kepler 442 system. The Vracti are a biological weapon system, right? They consume organic matter to fuel their growth and reproduction. But what happens to a biological system when you introduce the right kind of toxin? It dies, Mordun said slowly. Exactly. But you've been thinking about toxins in terms of conventional biochemical weapons. Stuff that kills quickly and efficiently. That's not what we need here. Harrison's fingers moved across the interface, pulling up data streams that Zeftar recognized as deep space sensor readings. What we need is something that makes them want to die. Zeftar's mandibles clicked in confusion. I do not understand. Psychological warfare, Harrison explained. Every species in the galaxy fights with the assumption that their enemies want to survive. You try to make survival impossible, so they surrender or retreat. But what if you make survival undesirable? The Kithara commander's crystalline mind began to process this concept, running through the implications. You are suggesting that we attack their morale rather than their physical capabilities. I'm suggesting we attack their sanity, Harrison corrected. The Vracti operate as a collective consciousness, right? They're all connected through some kind of biological neural network. That's a strength when it comes to coordination and tactical response, but it's also a massive vulnerability. Harrison pulled up a new section of the display, showing the complex bioelectrical patterns that Coalition scientists had detected emanating from Vracti ships. If you can introduce the right kind of signal into that network, you can mess with their entire collective decision-making process. Make them paranoid, confused, unable to trust their own perceptions. The Coalition's Xenobiological Research Division has studied Vracti neural patterns extensively, Zeftar said. Their findings indicate that the collective consciousness is remarkably stable and resistant to external interference. That's because your xenobiologists are thinking like scientists instead of warriors, Harrison replied. They're looking for clean, precise methods of disruption. But the human brain isn't clean or precise. It's a mess of competing impulses, contradictory emotions, and irrational fears. And sometimes when you're trying to break something, a little chaos is exactly what you need. Mordun leaned forward. What kind of chaos? Harrison's expression grew serious. General, have you ever heard of something called information warfare? It's a concept humans developed during our electronic age. The idea is that you don't attack your enemy's weapons or soldiers directly. Instead, you attack their ability to understand what's happening around them. You flood their communication networks with false data, contradictory orders, fake intelligence reports. You make them so uncertain about what's real that they start making mistakes. Zeftar found himself genuinely intrigued despite his reservations. And you believe this approach would be effective against a collective consciousness? I think it would be devastatingly effective, Harrison said. A collective consciousness is like a vast computer network, and humans have been hacking computer networks since we invented computers. The principles are the same whether you're dealing with silicon chips or biological neural tissue. The human began outlining his proposal in greater detail, and as he spoke, Zeftar realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in his long military career, a completely alien approach to warfare. Where the Coalition had sought to match the Vracti's strength with strength, Harrison was proposing to turn their greatest advantage into a weapon against them. It was brilliant. It was also completely insane. And as Zeftar listened to the human sergeant explain how Earth's military forces had perfected the art of psychological warfare through centuries of conflict, he began to understand why the younger races of the galaxy regarded humans with such mixture of fascination and fear. These creatures didn't just fight wars. They approached conflict like a science, constantly innovating and adapting their methods based on hard-earned experience. This strategy would require resources and capabilities that we currently lack, Zeftar said finally. The kind of precise neural interference you're describing would require technology that doesn't exist. Harrison's grin returned. Commander, I think you're going to be very surprised by what human military engineers can accomplish when properly motivated. Give us 3 days and access to your fabrication facilities, and we'll build you a weapon that will make the Vrakti wish they'd never evolved consciousness in the first place. As the meeting continued, Zeftar found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about warfare, strategy, and the nature of conflict itself. This human sergeant, with his lowly rank and primitive origins, was proposing tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. And for the first time since the Vrakti offensive began, Zeftar began to believe that they might actually have a chance of winning. 72 hours later, Zeftar stood in the same war room, but everything had changed. The sterile, orderly space that had once reflected the Coalition's methodical approach to military planning now resembled something between a research laboratory and what humans apparently called a garage workshop. Cables snaked across the floor, connecting improvised devices that hummed with unfamiliar energy signatures. The air itself felt different, charged with an electric anticipation that made Zeftar's antennae twitch. Sergeant Harrison moved between workstations with the easy confidence of someone completely in his element, barking orders to a team of human technicians who had materialized seemingly from nowhere. Zeftar had learned that these weren't regular Coalition personnel. They were specialists from something called the Terran Irregular Warfare Division, a military unit that officially didn't exist and unofficially scared the hell out of every intelligence service in the galaxy. Status report, Harrison called out, not bothering to look up from a complex array of quantum processors that definitely hadn't been there 3 days ago. Neural Pattern Mapper is online and calibrated, replied a pale, human woman whose fingers moved across holographic interfaces with inhuman precision. We've got clean reads on Vrakti collective consciousness frequencies across 17 different neural bands. Excellent. Chin, what about the broadcast array? A stocky man with grease-stained coveralls looked up from what appeared to be a fusion reactor connected to a collection of crystalline amplifiers. We're ready to pump out whatever signal pattern you want, Sarge. Fair warning, though. This setup is going to draw about 3 times the power output of this ship's primary engines. We might want to warn the engineering crew before we light this candle. Harrison finally looked up, his eyes finding Zeftar across the controlled chaos of the workspace. Commander, I think it's time we showed you what human military engineering can accomplish when we're properly motivated. Zeftar approached cautiously, his tactical computer struggling to classify the strange hybrid of technologies he was seeing. Coalition manufacturing systems were precise, elegant, designed for optimal efficiency and minimal resource waste. What the humans had created looked like something that had been assembled by particularly intelligent scavengers. Functional, but chaotic in a way that offended every principle of proper engineering. This appears to be a significant deviation from standard fabrication protocols, Zeftar observed carefully. Harrison laughed. Commander, standard fabrication protocols are designed for peacetime. When you're at war, the only protocol that matters is whatever works. And trust me, this is going to work. The human gestured toward a central console where data streams flowed in patterns that hurt to look at directly. What we've built here is essentially a psychological warfare weapon designed specifically for collective consciousness entities. The core principle is simple. We're going to flood their neural network with carefully crafted misinformation that will cause them to doubt their own perceptions and decision-making processes. How is this different from standard electronic warfare techniques? Zeftar asked. The Coalition has extensive experience with communication jamming and data corruption. Because we're not trying to jam their communications or corrupt their data, Harrison explained. We're trying to drive them insane. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Zeftar felt his certainty wavering again. In all his centuries of military service, he had never heard a fellow officer speak so casually about deliberately inflicting mental suffering on an enemy. It violated every principle of civilized warfare, every convention that separated intelligent beings from mere beasts. And yet, as he looked at the holographic display showing the continued advance of the Vracti swarm, now only hours away from the outer defensive perimeter of the Kepler 442 system, Zeftar found himself genuinely curious about what these strange, violent creatures might have devised. Explain the mechanism, he said simply. Harrison's expression grew serious as he began manipulating the central console. The display shifted to show a complex, three-dimensional model of what Zeftar recognized as Vracti neural architecture, the biological equivalent of a computer network, but vastly more complex and interconnected. The Vracti collective consciousness operates on the principle of shared experience, Harrison began. Every individual drone shares its sensory input with the whole, and the whole processes that information to make collective decisions. It's incredibly efficient, but it also means that every drone implicitly trusts the information it receives from the network. Harrison highlighted several nodes in the neural network model. What we're going to do is introduce false sensory data into their network, not random noise. Carefully crafted experiences designed to create psychological stress and paranoia. We're going to make them see things that aren't there, hear sounds that don't exist, and feel sensations that have no physical source. Zeftar's mandibles clicked as he processed this information. The Vracti would quickly identify such false data and filter it from their network. That's what makes this beautiful, Harrison replied, his voice taking on an almost artistic quality. We're not going to make it obvious that the data is false. We're going to make it subtly wrong in ways that will make them question everything they're experiencing. The human began running simulations on the display, showing how false sensory data would propagate through the Vracti network. Imagine you're part of a collective consciousness, and suddenly you start receiving conflicting reports about the same event. Drone A says it sees an enemy ship. Drone B says there's nothing there. Drone C reports weapons fire from an empty sector of space. Your rational mind knows that at least two of these reports must be false. But which ones? Zeftar found himself genuinely intrigued despite his moral reservations. The collective would attempt to resolve the contradiction through consensus analysis. Exactly. And that's when we introduce more contradictory data. Now Drone D is reporting that Drone A is malfunctioning. He says that Drone B has been compromised by enemy action. And Drone F insists that both A and B are feeding false information into the network. Pretty soon, the collective doesn't know what to believe about anything. The implications were staggering. Zeftar ran quick calculations on his tactical computer, modeling how such confusion might affect Vracti combat effectiveness. The results were remarkable. A collective consciousness that couldn't trust its own sensory input would be effectively paralyzed, unable to coordinate attacks, or even maintain formation cohesion. This is psychological torture, Zeftar said quietly. Harrison's expression didn't change. Yes, it is. And before you start feeling sorry for them, Commander, let me remind you that the Vracti have consumed 17 star systems worth of sentient life. They don't take prisoners, they don't negotiate, and they don't show mercy. They eat everything that's carbon-based and use the biomass to breed more of themselves. Sometimes, when you're fighting monsters, you have to be willing to become something monstrous yourself. The human's words struck something deep in Zeftar's consciousness. Throughout his long military career, he had always operated under the assumption that there were lines that civilized beings simply did not cross, regardless of the circumstances. The idea of deliberately inflicting psychological suffering seemed to violate the very principles that separated intelligent life from the chaos of natural selection. But as he looked at the holographic display showing the inexorable advance of the Vracti swarm, Zeftar found himself wondering whether those principles were luxuries that the galaxy could no longer afford. "Show me the implementation," he said finally. Harrison nodded and began explaining the technical details of their psychological warfare weapon. The system was elegantly cruel in its simplicity. Quantum communication arrays would broadcast carefully crafted neural signals directly into the Vracti collective consciousness network. These signals would appear to be legitimate sensory data from individual drones, but would contain subtle inconsistencies designed to create doubt and paranoia. "The beauty of this approach is that the Vracti will do most of the work for us," Harrison explained. "Once we introduce enough contradictory information into their network, their own attempts to resolve the contradictions will create feedback loops that amplify the psychological effects. They'll start doubting not just the false data we're feeding them, but their own genuine perceptions as well." As the human continued his explanation, Zeftar began to understand the true genius of the strategy. It wasn't just about creating confusion. It was about weaponizing the Vracti's greatest strength against them. Their collective consciousness, which made them nearly unstoppable in conventional warfare, would become a liability once it was corrupted with false information. "How long will the effects last?" Zeftar asked. Harrison's grin was predatory. "That's the really beautiful part, Commander. The psychological damage we're going to inflict isn't temporary. Once we've convinced them that they can't trust their own perceptions, that paranoia will become a permanent part of their collective consciousness. Every battle they fight after this, they'll be second-guessing themselves, wondering if what they're seeing is real or just another false signal." The implications were staggering. If Harrison's strategy worked, they wouldn't just be winning a single battle. They would be permanently crippling the Vracti as a military force. "There's one thing you should know," Harrison added, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "This weapon isn't surgical. Once we activate it, every Vracti in the system will be affected. That includes any drones that might be capable of individual thought or consciousness. We're not just attacking their military capabilities, we're attacking their fundamental ability to perceive reality." Zeftar felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. "You are describing genocide." "No, Harrison replied firmly. Genocide is what the Vracti have been doing to every species they encounter. What we're doing is self-defense. The fact that our methods happen to be psychologically devastating doesn't change the moral calculus." The human turned to face him directly, and Zeftar saw something in his eyes that gave him pause. It wasn't cruelty or sadism. It was something far more unsettling. It was the calm, professional detachment of someone who had made peace with the necessity of doing terrible things. "Commander, I've studied the military history of every species in the Coalition," Harrison continued. "You've all fought wars, sometimes brutal ones, but you've always operated under the assumption that there are limits to what civilized beings will do to each other. Humans gave up that assumption a long time ago. We learned that when you're fighting for survival, the only rule that matters is winning." As if summoned by their conversation, General Mordun entered the war room, his massive frame moving with unusual urgency. "Commander Zeftar, Sergeant Harrison, we have a situation. The Vracti Advanced Fleet has accelerated their approach. They'll be within weapons range of our outer defenses in 6 hours." Harrison immediately moved to the central console, his fingers dancing across the controls with practiced efficiency. "Then, it's time to find out if human psychological warfare techniques work on collective consciousness entities." The next few minutes were a blur of activity as the human technical team made final preparations to their improvised weapon system. Zeftar found himself caught between fascination and horror as he watched these strange, violent creatures prepare to unleash a form of warfare that violated every principle of civilized conflict. "All systems are green," reported the pale woman at the neural pattern mapper. We have clean target locks on the primary Vrakti consciousness nodes. Power levels are optimal, added the Mansion. We're ready to broadcast on your command. Harrison looked up from his central console, his eyes finding Zeftar across the chaotic workspace. This is your call, Commander. Once we activate this weapon, there's no going back. The Vrakti will either be permanently crippled as a military force, or they'll adapt to our psychological warfare techniques and become even more dangerous than before. Zeftar felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him like gravity from a neutron star. Throughout his long military career, he had faced many difficult choices, but never one that seemed to challenge the very nature of what it meant to be a civilized being. The humans were offering him a weapon that could save the galaxy, but at the cost of crossing moral boundaries that had never been crossed before. And yet, as he looked at the holographic display showing the approaching Vrakti fleet, each red, representing millions of consumed lives, Zeftar realized that the choice had already been made. "Activate the weapon," he said quietly. Harrison nodded and turned his team. "You heard the commander. Light it up." The world exploded into chaos. The moment Harrison activated the psychological warfare array, reality itself seemed to buckle. The improvised weapon system drew power from the eternal vigilance as fusion cores with such intensity that the lights flickered throughout the massive command ship. Every screen in the war room flashed white for an instant before displaying data streams that moved too fast for even Zeftar's enhanced perception to follow. But it wasn't the technical aspects of the weapon that stunned the Kithra commander. It was the immediate, visceral response from the Vrakti fleet. On the holographic display, the red dots representing enemy bioships began to move erratically. Formation patterns that had remained consistent throughout their advance across 17 star systems suddenly dissolved into chaos. Ships that had moved with perfect coordination moments before now seemed to be operating independently, some accelerating toward the coalition defensive line, while others veered off on random trajectories. "What are they seeing?" Zeftar asked, his mandibles clicking with nervous energy. Harrison's eyes were locked on a secondary display that showed real-time analysis of Vrakti neural network traffic. The normally smooth flow of collective consciousness data had become a jagged nightmare of contradictory signals and feedback loops. "Everything and nothing," he replied, his voice carrying a mixture of fascination and professional satisfaction. "We're feeding them approximately 3,000 false sensory inputs per second, each one carefully designed to contradict information they're receiving from their actual sensory organs." The human gestured toward a smaller screen showing what appeared to be a first-person view from within the Vrakti collective consciousness. Zeftar watched in horrified fascination as the perspective shifted rapidly between seemingly contradictory realities. One moment showing empty space, the next revealing massive coalition battleships that didn't actually exist, then shifting to display their own fleet as hostile entities firing upon themselves. "By the ancient crystals," Zeftar whispered, unconsciously using an oath from his species' distant past. "They cannot distinguish between reality and illusion." "That's the point," Harrison replied. "Humans learned a long time ago that the most effective way to defeat an enemy isn't necessarily to destroy their weapons or kill their soldiers. Sometimes it's more effective to attack their ability to understand what's happening around them. A confused enemy makes mistakes. A paranoid enemy makes even bigger mistakes." As if to illustrate his point, several Vrakti bioships on the display began firing their primary weapons, not at coalition targets, but at other Vrakti vessels. The collective consciousness that had made them nearly invincible was now turning their greatest strength into a catastrophic vulnerability. "They're attacking each other," General Mordun observed, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and something that might have been horror. "Of course they are," Harrison said matter-of-factly. "We've convinced them that some members of their own fleet have been compromised by enemy action. From their perspective, those ships aren't allies anymore. They're infiltrators that need to be eliminated before they can spread false information throughout the network." Zeftar watched the display with growing unease as the Vrakti fleet tore itself apart. The psychological weapon wasn't just disrupting their coordination, it was triggering a cascade of self-destructive behavior that violated every principle of military logic. Bioships that had survived thousands of battles were being destroyed not by enemy action, but by their own allies who could no longer trust their own perceptions. "This is not warfare," Zeftar said quietly. "This is something else entirely." Harrison turned to face him, and the Kithara commander was struck by the complete absence of triumph in the human's expression. There was satisfaction, yes, and professional pride in a job well done. But there was also something darker, a weary acceptance that seemed at odds with the devastating victory they were witnessing. "You're right," Harrison replied. "It's not warfare in the way your species understands it. It's survival. And sometimes when you're fighting for survival against something that wants to consume every trace of life in the galaxy, you have to be willing to use weapons that civilized beings find morally repugnant." The human paused, his eyes returning to the display where the Vrakti self-destruction continued with mechanical inevitability. "My species learned something during our long history of killing each other, Commander. We learned that there are fates worse than death, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do for your enemy is to kill them quickly rather than let them suffer indefinitely." Zeftar felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. "Are you suggesting that what we are doing to the Vrakti is worse than simply destroying them?" "I'm suggesting that we're breaking their minds," Harrison replied with brutal honesty. "The psychological damage we're inflicting isn't temporary. Even if we stopped the broadcast right now, the Vrakti collective consciousness would never fully recover. They've lost the ability to trust their own perceptions, and for a collective consciousness entity, that's essentially a form of permanent madness." The implications hit Zeftar like a physical blow. Throughout his long military career, he had killed enemy soldiers, destroyed enemy ships, and made strategic decisions that resulted in massive casualties. But he had always operated under the assumption that death, however tragic, was at least final. What the humans had created was something far more disturbing, a weapon that left its targets alive, but fundamentally broken. "Why?" Zeftar asked. "Why would your species develop such methods?" Harrison's expression grew distant, as if he were remembering something from long ago. "Because we had to, Commander. Human military history is full of conflicts where conventional weapons weren't enough. Wars where the enemy was so fanatical, so committed to total victory, that the only way to stop them was to break their will to fight entirely." The human gestured toward the display, where the Vrakti fleet was still consuming itself in an orgy of self-directed violence. "The Vrakti are like that. They don't negotiate, they don't retreat, and they don't show mercy. The only way to stop them permanently is to make them incapable of functioning as a coherent military force." As they watched, the psychological warfare weapon achieved something that months of conventional military action had failed to accomplish. The advanced elements of the Vrakti swarm, which had seemed unstoppable just hours before, were now completely neutralized. Not destroyed, but rendered utterly ineffective as fighting forces. "The primary consciousness node is fragmenting," reported the pale woman at the neural pattern mapper. Her voice carried a note of professional interest that somehow made the observation even more unsettling. "The collective is attempting to isolate compromised sections of the network, but the psychological contamination is spreading faster than they can contain it." Harrison nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what we wanted to happen. The beautiful thing about this kind of warfare is that the target does most of the work for you. Once you introduce enough doubt and paranoia into a collective consciousness, it starts to consume itself from within." Zeftar found himself struggling with concepts that challenged everything he thought he knew about military ethics. Is there no way to reverse the effects? To restore their capacity for rational thought? "Theoretically, yes," Harrison replied. "But It would require rebuilding their entire collective consciousness from scratch, essentially creating a completely new entity. The Vrakti we're fighting today would cease to exist as surely as if we had destroyed them with antimatter warheads. The humans' words hung in the air like a physical presence. Zeftar realized that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The weapon they had used wasn't just devastating, it was fundamentally transformative in ways that conventional weapons could never be. You are saying that we have committed genocide without killing anyone, Zeftar said slowly. I'm saying we've done what was necessary to protect the galaxy from an existential threat, Harrison corrected. The moral implications of our methods are secondary to the practical results. The Vrakti will never again pose a threat to intelligent life because they've lost the capacity for coherent thought and action. As if responding to their conversation, new alerts began flashing across the display screens. The remaining Vrakti bioships, those that hadn't been destroyed in the collective's self-directed rampage, were beginning to withdraw from the system. But their movement patterns were erratic, purposeless, less like a strategic retreat than like the random wandering of creatures that had lost the ability to understand their own situation. "They're leaving," General Mordun observed, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and something that might have been regret. "They're fleeing," Harrison corrected. "The collective consciousness is too damaged to maintain coherent strategic objectives. They're operating on pure survival instinct now, trying to get away from whatever they perceive as the source of their psychological torment." Zeftar watched the withdrawal with mixed feelings. The immediate threat to the Kepler 442 system had been neutralized, but the cost of victory was unlike anything he had experienced in his long military career. They had won, but they had done so by becoming something that his species would have regarded as monstrous. "What happens now?" he asked. Harrison began shutting down the psychological warfare array, his movements efficient and professional. "Now we write reports that classify this entire operation under levels of secrecy that most coalition members don't even know exist. We document the effectiveness of psychological warfare against collective consciousness entities, and we hope that we never have to use these methods again." The human paused in his work, his eyes meeting Zeftar's across the chaotic workspace. "But if we do have to use them again, we'll be ready. Because that's what humans do, Commander. We learn from every conflict, we adapt our methods based on what works, and we make sure that we're always prepared for the next threat that wants to wipe out intelligent life in the galaxy." As the immediate crisis passed, Zeftar found himself reflecting on what he had witnessed. The humans had demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond anything the Coalition's intelligence services had suspected. They hadn't just won a battle. They had redefined the very nature of warfare itself. "Sergeant Harrison," Zeftar said formally, "I believe I owe you an apology. When you first arrived, I dismissed your contributions as the product of a primitive military tradition. I now realize that I was fundamentally mistaken about the sophistication of human warfare techniques." Harrison's expression softened slightly. "No apology necessary, Commander. Every species in the galaxy makes the same mistake when they first encounter humans. You assume that because we're young and our technology seems crude, we must not have anything to teach you about warfare. But the truth is, we've been perfecting the art of killing for longer than most species have been spacefaring." The human gestured toward the now-quiet displays that showed the Vrakti retreat continuing. "The galaxy is full of species that are stronger than us, smarter than us, more advanced than us in every measurable way. But there's one thing that humans do better than anyone else, and that's finding ways to win wars that everyone else considers unwinnable." As Zeftar processed these words, he realized that his understanding of humanity had been fundamentally transformed. These weren't primitive barbarians who had stumbled into interstellar travel. They were a species that had weaponized conflict itself, turning warfare into a science that they had been studying for millennia. And for the first time since joining the Coalition, Zeftar found himself genuinely grateful that humans were on their side. 3 months after the Battle of Kepler, 442, Commander Zeftar stood in his private quarters aboard the Eternal Vigilance, staring out at the stars through the massive viewport that dominated one wall. The ship was en route to Coalition headquarters on Proxima Prime, where he would deliver his classified report on the human psychological warfare capabilities. But it wasn't the upcoming debriefing that occupied his thoughts. It was the fundamental transformation in his understanding of warfare, strategy, and the nature of intelligent life itself. The official records would show that the Vrakti swarm had suffered a catastrophic systems failure that resulted in their withdrawal from Coalition space. The psychological warfare weapon and its effects would remain classified at levels that most Coalition members would never know existed. Only a handful of individuals across the galaxy would ever know the truth about what had happened in that distant star system. But Zeftar knew, and the knowledge had changed him in ways that he was still struggling to understand. A soft chime indicated that someone was requesting permission to enter his quarters. "Come in," he called, turning away from the viewport. Sergeant Jake Harrison stepped through the doorway, his human features showing the subtle signs of fatigue that his species displayed when they hadn't slept enough. Over the past 3 months, Harrison had become something of a permanent fixture aboard the Coalition command vessel, ostensibly serving as a cultural liaison between human and alien military forces. In reality, Zeftar suspected that the human was gathering intelligence on Coalition military capabilities while simultaneously studying non-human approaches to warfare. "Commander," Harrison said formally, though his tone carried the easy familiarity that had developed between them over the weeks since their victory over the Vrakti. "I wanted to discuss something with you before we reach Proxima Prime." Zeftar gestured toward the seating area in the center of his quarters, a collection of chairs and surfaces designed to accommodate the various alien physiologies found throughout the Coalition. "Please sit. What is troubling you?" Harrison settled into one of the human-compatible chairs, his expression more serious than usual. "I've been thinking about our conversation after the battle, about the moral implications of what we did to the Vrakti. You said that what we did was worse than genocide because we left them alive, but fundamentally broken." The Kithra commander's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "I remember. You seemed to believe that the ends justified the means, regardless of the psychological damage we inflicted." "I did believe that," Harrison replied, "and part of me still does. But I've had 3 months to think about it, and I'm not sure the moral calculus is as simple as I made it sound." Zeftar found himself genuinely surprised by the human's admission. Throughout their interactions since the battle, Harrison had displayed the confident certainty that seemed to characterize human military thinking. The idea that he might be experiencing doubts about their victory was unexpected. "What has changed your perspective?" Zeftar asked. Harrison was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the confines of the room. "I've been reading Coalition historical records, studying the military traditions of different species. Most galactic civilizations have concepts that roughly translate to honorable warfare or justified conflict. They have rules, conventions, lines that they don't cross even when fighting for survival." The human paused, his expression growing distant. "Humans used to have those concepts too. We called them things like the laws of war or rules of engagement. But we abandoned most of them a long time ago, during conflicts where following the rules meant losing everything we cared about." Zeftar felt his certainty beginning to waver again, just as it had during their first meeting months ago. "Are you suggesting that humanity has lost something essential in becoming so effective at warfare?" "I'm suggesting that maybe there's a difference between being effective at warfare and being good at it," Harrison replied. "Every human military officer learns about something we call Pyrrhic victory, winning a battle at such cost that it might as well be defeat. But what we did to the Vrakti wasn't Pyrrhic. It was perfectly effective. We neutralized an existential threat with minimal casualties on our side." The human leaned forward, his voice taking on an intensity that Zeftar had learned to associate with important revelations. "But I've been wondering if there's something worse than Pyrrhic victory. What do you call it when you win so completely, so devastatingly, that the very act of winning changes who you are. The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Zeftar thought he understood about military success. Throughout his long career, he had always assumed that victory was inherently good, that protecting innocent life justified almost any tactical decision. But Harrison's words forced him to confront the possibility that some victories came at costs that weren't immediately apparent. You are questioning whether the preservation of galactic civilization was worth the moral compromise required to achieve it, Zeftar said slowly. I'm questioning whether we're still the same civilization we were trying to preserve, Harrison corrected. The Coalition has always prided itself on representing the best aspects of intelligent life: cooperation, mutual respect, the peaceful resolution of conflicts. But what happens to those ideals when you adopt warfare techniques that are fundamentally incompatible with them? Zeftar found himself genuinely unsettled by the direction of their conversation. He had spent months trying to reconcile the necessity of their victory with his species' moral philosophy, but he had always assumed that the difficulty was temporary, a matter of adjusting his perspective rather than questioning the fundamental nature of their achievement. What would you have had us do? Zeftar asked. Allow the Vrakti to continue consuming inhabited worlds? Accept the extinction of countless species rather than compromise our moral principles? I don't know, Harrison admitted, and the honesty in his voice was somehow more disturbing than any certainty would have been. That's what makes this so difficult. I can't point to a better alternative, can't suggest a strategy that would have been both effective and morally acceptable. All I can do is recognize that we cross a line and wonder what that means for who we are now. The human stood and moved to the viewport, his silhouette framed against the star field beyond. There's something else I need to tell you, Commander. Something about human military doctrine that I didn't mention during our planning sessions. Zeftar felt his antennae twitch with nervous anticipation. What is it? The psychological warfare techniques we used against the Vrakti weren't developed for fighting aliens, Harrison said quietly. They were developed for fighting other humans. Every method, every strategy, every cruel innovation we used, we learned it by using it against our own species. The implications hit Zeftar like a physical blow. Throughout their interactions, he had assumed that human warfare techniques were the product of necessity, desperate methods developed in response to existential threats. The idea that they had been refined through countless conflicts between members of the same species was almost incomprehensible. You're saying that humans have been conducting psychological warfare against each other for centuries? Zeftar asked. For millennia, Harrison corrected. We've been studying how to break minds, destroy morale, and shatter the will to fight since before we developed agriculture. The techniques we used against the Vrakti represent the accumulated knowledge of thousands of human conflicts, refined through trial and error over countless generations. Harrison turned away from the viewport to face Zeftar directly. Do you understand what that means, Commander? It means that humans aren't just good at warfare. We're evolutionarily optimized for it. We've spent our entire species' history learning how to kill efficiently, how to break our enemies psychologically, and how to win wars at any cost. The human's words challenged every assumption Zeftar had made about the nature of intelligent life. Most species in the galaxy had certainly engaged in warfare, but it was generally understood to be an aberration, a failure of civilization rather than an expression of it. The idea that an entire species could develop warfare into a fundamental aspect of their culture was profoundly disturbing. And yet you chose to use these capabilities to save other species rather than dominate them, Zeftar observed. That suggests that humans are capable of transcending their evolutionary programming. Does it? Harrison asked. Or what does it just mean that we've found better targets? The Vrakti were a threat to everyone, including humans. By destroying them, we weren't being altruistic, we were being practical. We eliminated a competing predator species. The cynical interpretation of their victory was something Zeftar had never considered. Throughout the months since the battle, He had operated under the assumption that human participation in the coalition represented a genuine commitment to peaceful cooperation between species. The possibility that it might simply be pragmatic alliance building was deeply unsettling. You seem to be suggesting that human nature is fundamentally predatory, Zeftar said carefully. I'm suggesting that human nature is fundamentally adaptive, Harrison replied. We're very good at identifying threats and developing effective responses to them. Sometimes that means cooperation, sometimes it means competition, and sometimes it means total warfare. The key is that we're always optimizing for survival, even when that optimization requires us to become something that other species find morally repugnant. Harrison moved back to his chair, settling into it with the fluid grace that seemed to characterize human movement. That's what I wanted to discuss with you before we reach Proxima Prime, Commander. You're going to be debriefing coalition leadership on human military capabilities. They're going to ask you for recommendations about how to integrate human forces into broader coalition strategy. Zeftar felt his certainty wavering once again. What would you recommend? I'd recommend caution, Harrison said simply. Humans are incredibly effective allies when your interests align with ours. But we're also incredibly dangerous when they don't. The same capabilities that allowed us to save the galaxy from the Vrakti could just as easily be turned against the coalition itself if circumstances changed. The human paused, his expression growing thoughtful. There's an old human saying, "He who fights monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster." I think we passed that point a long time ago, Commander. The question now is whether the galaxy is better off with human monsters on their side or standing against them. As their conversation continued, Zeftar found himself grappling with concepts that challenged everything he thought he knew about interstellar relations, military alliance, and the nature of civilized behavior. The humans had proven themselves capable of extraordinary military effectiveness, but that effectiveness came with implications that extended far beyond any single battle or conflict. When Harrison finally left his quarters, Zeftar returned to the viewport and resumed his contemplation of the stars. In a few days, he would deliver his report to coalition leadership, and they would have to decide how to proceed with their relationship with humanity. It was a decision that would shape the future of the galaxy, and Zeftar was no longer certain what recommendation he should make. The humans had saved them all from the Vrakti swarm. But as he reflected on everything he had learned about human nature, human history, and human capabilities, Zeftar couldn't escape the feeling that they had simply traded one existential threat for another, one that was far more intelligent, far more adaptable, and far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. The stars offered no answers, only the cold certainty that the galaxy had been fundamentally changed by what had happened at Kepler 442. Whether that change would ultimately prove beneficial or catastrophic remained to be seen. But as Zeftar prepared his final report, he found himself hoping that future generations would prove wise enough to handle the legacy of humanity's gift for warfare. Because if they weren't, the cure might prove far worse than any disease the galaxy had ever faced. The war was over. Humanity had won. And somehow, that was the most terrifying thought of all.